Janet Jackson, the immortal icon of pop, the queen who gave the world unforgettable anthems like Rhythm Nation, 1814, and That's the Way Love Goes, was never simply born into greatness. Her story is not one of sudden luck or effortless privilege. It is a story of fire, of a child raised in poverty, of discipline so sharp it left scars, of nights where survival seemed like the only goal, and of a woman who grew up to transform all that struggle into rhythms that carried the voices of millions. Janet Demita Jo Jackson was born on May 16, 1966, in Gary, Indiana, the youngest of 10 children in a small two-bedroom house on Jackson Street. Life there was crowded, chaotic, and yet, within those walls, a storm of ambition was quietly brewing. Her father, Joe Jackson, was a steelworker by day and a frustrated guitarist by night, a man whose unfulfilled dreams pushed him to mold his children into the stars he never got to be. Her mother, Catherine, balanced work and home, praying for peace while trying to protect her children with a quiet strength. The family knew hardship. Marlon's twin brother, Brandon, had died shortly after birth, leaving a wound that never truly closed. In that atmosphere of loss and pressure, the Jackson children were trained like soldiers, drilled in music and performance with military precision. Mistakes were punished, affection was rare, and even in their own home, Joe Jackson demanded they address him not as Dad, but as Joseph. For Janet, childhood was less about playing outside with friends and more about memorizing dance steps, rehearsing harmonies, and carrying the weight of being part of a family that was already turning into a phenomenon. By the time she was a young girl, the Jackson Five had exploded into fame, her older brothers dazzling the world with their talent. Yet, for Janet, being in the shadow of that spotlight meant she often felt invisible, seen only as Michael's little sister, not as Janet. But in those shadows, resilience was forged. She learned discipline, she learned strength, and most importantly, she learned that her worth would one day have to be fought for. The Jackson home was a paradox, both the cradle of genius and the cage of lost childhood. Janet's early memories were not of carefree laughter, but of being pushed beyond her years, forced to carry herself with a maturity no child should have to. And yet, in that relentless push, she discovered the willpower that would eventually make her unstoppable. Janet's journey into fame did not wait for her to grow up. At just 7 years old, she was already on stage in Las Vegas, performing routines that most adults would struggle to master. By the age of 10, she was cast in the Jacksons variety show. Her childhood turned into rehearsed smiles, practiced lines, and camera-ready charm. Soon came roles in Good Times, Different Strokes, and Fame, giving her the polish of a performer while taking away the innocence of a child. Under the direction of her father, she released her first 2 albums in the early 80s, but those records were not truly her own. They were carefully managed products, voices of producers and handlers rather than Janet herself. She later admitted she felt trapped, that every step she took was decided for her, that she was still living in the shadow of her brothers, especially Michael. The world did not yet see her as Janet Jackson, the artist. They only saw her as a relative of greatness. That constant comparison cut her deeply, especially when Michael himself would tease her about her weight, something she later revealed had permanently scarred her self-esteem. But that pain ignited a fire. By 1986, Janet made the boldest move of her young life. She broke ties with her father's management and sought her own voice. Partnering with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, she created Control in just 6 weeks, an album that was not only music, but a manifesto. With sharp beats and unapologetic lyrics, she declared independence. Songs like Nasty and What Have You Done For Me Lately spoke directly to her journey, announcing to the world that she was no longer just a little sister or a managed product. She was Janet, and she was in control. The world listened. Control sold millions, cementing her as a force of her own. But it was Rhythm Nation 1814 that transformed her from a pop star into a cultural leader. More than just an album, it was a movement, uniting messages of racial justice, unity, and empowerment with some of the most iconic choreography of all time. She became the only artist in history to have 7 top 5 singles from one album, and her music videos set new standards on MTV. Janet was no longer in Michael's shadow. She was walking beside him, beside Madonna, beside Prince. And yet, for all her triumphs, the loneliness behind closed doors remained. She poured her battles with identity and depression into her 1997 masterpiece, The Velvet Rope, a deeply personal album that became a lifeline for fans struggling with their own demons. Critics called it one of her greatest works, and Janet herself admitted that creating it was like wrapping a bandage around her soul. She was no longer just entertaining, she was healing herself, and in the process, healing millions. But for Janet Jackson, peace was always fragile, and storms seemed to follow her wherever she went. The controversies surrounding Michael often spilled into her own life, unfairly tainting her reputation by association. Even their historic duet, Scream, in 1995, which should have been a joyful collaboration between siblings, was marred by the strict control of handlers who kept them apart during filming. But the most devastating blow to Janet's career came in 2004. During the Super Bowl halftime show, a wardrobe malfunction lasting less than a second ignited one of the biggest scandals in television history. America gasped, the media erupted, and while her male counterpart escaped largely unscathed, Janet was vilified. She was blacklisted from radio, banned from television, and erased from opportunities she had once ruled. One fleeting accident had suddenly overshadowed decades of brilliance. Janet later said with pain, "One mistake on stage and my entire career was judged." For years, she lived in exile, silenced by an industry she had once dominated. Yet even in those dark years, she did not shatter. Instead, she quietly rebuilt, refusing to let shame or censorship erase her voice. In 2015, she returned with Unbreakable. Released under her own label, its very title a defiant declaration of her spirit. Though scarred, punished, and doubted, Janet stood unbroken. By then, her legacy was undeniable. Over 100 million records sold, record-breaking tours, and #1 albums across 4 consecutive decades. She was no longer just a pop star. She was a survivor, an institution, a living testament to endurance. And yet, for all her triumphs, her personal life revealed a side far more vulnerable than the stage ever showed. In matters of the heart, Janet Jackson faced battles just as fierce as those in her career. At 18, desperate to escape her father's suffocating control, she secretly married James DeBarge, a fellow musician. At first, it seemed like love might offer the freedom she craved, but instead, it became another prison. James struggled with addiction, and their nights together were often filled with chaos, fear, and tears. Friends recalled moments when Janet would sneak away in the middle of the night, just to breathe outside the walls of pain. What should have been a sanctuary became a cage. Within a year, the marriage was annulled, leaving Janet scarred but wiser. Yet, the wounds of that relationship lingered for decades. Tabloids spread rumors that she had secretly had a child with James, a falsehood that haunted her for nearly 40 years. Finally, in her 2022 documentary, she addressed it directly. That was not true. The exhaustion in her voice revealed the toll of living under a lie for so long. Love for Janet would never be simple. She sought companionship in later marriages and relationships, but none lasted without strain. Still, she continued to carry herself with grace, her resilience shining through even when her heart was heavy. Through it all, Janet's story remained one of survival. She had endured the suffocating rules of childhood, the loneliness of early fame, the cruelty of the industry, the humiliation of scandal, and the betrayals of love. And yet, she rose. From a crowded home in Gary, Indiana, to global superstardom, she had turned every scar into rhythm, every wound into melody. Janet Jackson is more than Michael's sister, more than a pop star, more than a scandal. She is a woman who took control, who faced the velvet rope of depression and tied it into songs of survival, who stood unbreakable, even when the world tried to break her. Her life remains one of the greatest testaments in music history, a reminder that pain does not silence, it sings.